The widowed muscular rancher rode in town alone for supplies, but found a hungry disabled Chinese bride begging for bread and water. The wind moved like an old hymn through Dawson's Crossing that morning, stirring dust over the wooden boards and the boots of those who still bothered to rise early. Elijah Boone rode in slow from the North Trail, his horse's breath steaming in the cold. He had the look of a man carved from labor, wide shoulders under a brown duster, eyes the color of burnt wheat, and silence trailing him like a second shadow. His left glove was patched twice over from fencing wire, his ring finger bare now for 2 long winters. He didn't come to town for talk. He came for salt, nails, and a coil of rope. But even men who carry grief like an old saddle still notice the world when it trembles, and he felt it, a faint voice cutting through wind and wagon creak. Across the street from Hensley's bakery, a woman sat against the post, her head lowered, both hands trembling in her lap. The hem of her faded blue dress was soaked with mud. Her right leg lay stiff and bent under her, the boot sole split open. Her face, pale as porcelain, streaked with soot, lifted just enough for him to see her lips move. "Please, water." The townsfolk passed her as they do with all suffering they don't understand. One man spat near the trough. A woman tugged her child away, whispering something sharp in his ear. Behind the bakery window, Martha Hensley folded her arms, chin high. "She's been sittin' there since dawn," she said to anyone listening. "Foreign beggar woman. Don't you give her a crumb, it only keeps her here." Elijah dismounted without a word. The wood of the hitch rail creaked as he tied his horse, the motion heavy but deliberate. He could feel every eye watching. When he stepped through the bakery door, the bell above it rang like judgment. Martha's smile was sugar over steel. "Well, if it ain't the widower Boone. What'll it be, bread for one?" "2 loaves," he said. His voice was low, shaped by the prairie wind more than speech. "And a jug of clean water." Her eyebrows lifted. "You feedin' the cripple out there?" He didn't answer. The coins clinked on the counter, silver dull under flour dust. The silence thickened. Finally, she reached for the bread, muttering, "Mercy's wasted on some." When Elijah stepped outside again, the air felt heavier, like the whole town held its breath. The woman had lowered her head again, shoulders drawn in small as if to vanish. He knelt beside her, the boards rough beneath his knees. Her hands flinched when he offered the loaf, then steadied as he pressed the water jug into them. She tried to speak but coughed instead, a dry sound from a hollow chest. "You don't have to," she whispered. Her accent softened the edges of her English, like silk torn on stone. He looked at her burned leg, at the cracked leather and the raw scar peeking through the fabric. "Everybody has to eat," he said simply. She took a bite, small, trembling, as if afraid the bread would vanish. He tore a piece for himself and leaned against the post beside her, watching the horizon fade into wind. For a moment, they shared nothing but silence and the rhythm of chewing, 2 strangers bound by hunger neither had chosen. From inside the bakery, laughter rose, sharp and thin. Elijah ignored it, but the woman winced. Her eyes were dark wells of exhaustion, yet behind them lived a strange composure, the quiet of someone long used to cruelty. "Name's Elijah Boone," he said finally, his tone almost reluctant. "Maylin," she replied, voice soft, each syllable careful. "My leg, no good." He nodded once. "Seen worse." When she finished half the loaf, he set his coat over her shoulders. The fabric dwarfed her frame. "You'll catch cold sittin' out here," he said. "I can't move far," she murmured. "Leg burned long ago. Walk hurts." The wind picked up, tugging strands of her black hair across her cheek. He reached out instinctively, brushed one aside, then pulled his hand back as if the touch burned. Her eyes met his, uncertain, searching for what kind of man he was. Behind them, hooves clattered and Sheriff Dobbs's voice carried over the street. "Boone, you causing charity trouble again?" Elijah turned, unamused. "Just buying bread." Dobbs sighed, scratching at his gray beard. "You know how folks are. Woman like her, she don't belong here." Could stir talk. Elijah looked back at Maylin, who now stared at her hands, the loaf half-eaten, shame written in every motion. "Let him talk," he said. The sheriff studied him for a long beat, then rode off without another word. The sun broke briefly through clouds, painting the dust in pale gold. Elijah noticed her eyes squinting at the light, not from pain but from memory. "In my village," she said softly, "light meant rice season. Or family." Her voice caught. "Here, light mean everyone can see me." He didn't know what to say, so he offered the only thing he had, presence. He untied his horse and held out a hand. "Can you stand?" It took her 2 tries. Her leg trembled under her weight, but she rose, leaning against the post until she found balance. The cane she didn't have he offered with his arm. She hesitated, pride fighting need, then placed her hand on his sleeve. As they crossed the street, murmurs followed, low voices carrying judgment like dust. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes forward. He led her to the freight house on the edge of town, where a broken lantern hung from the doorframe. Inside, it smelled of wood rot and old hay. He set down the jug. Ain't much, but better than the street. She touched the wall as if it were something holy. Thank you, she said. He nodded and stepped back into the light. I'll bring something warm later. Don't leave the door open. Wind'll take the place apart. She smiled faintly, a fragile curve that seemed to cost her strength. You help, stranger, she said. Why? He looked at her a long moment before answering. 'Cause someone once helped me. Didn't make me better than I am, but it kept me human. He turned to go, boots crunching over straw. As he reached the doorway, her voice came again, barely above the hush of wind. Mr. Boone, what if town hate you now? He paused, eyes on the horizon where the sun was dying behind the ridge. Wouldn't be the first thing they've hated me for. The freight house door closed behind him, leaving the faint glow of lantern light flickering through the cracks. The town resumed its rhythm. Gossip whispered like dry leaves, the baker's laughter rising again, the sheriff's horse fading into distance. Elijah mounted up, but his gaze lingered on the door. Somewhere inside, the woman he'd fed was whispering a prayer in a language no one here knew. The wind carried it away, soft, almost grateful. He tightened his reins and rode north. Yet halfway down the trail, he looked back once, as though something tethered him to that faint glow behind the boarded walls. The sky deepened to the color of bruised lavender, and in that moment, he realized he hadn't ridden into town for supplies after all. He'd come, without knowing, to remember what mercy felt like. And as the first stars cut through the dusk, he wondered if mercy, once given, could ever really let a man ride away. Rain came just before dusk, fine and silvery, whispering against the tin roof of the old freight house where Maylin sat by the door. Her burned leg throbbed in rhythm with the rain's patter, but she didn't move. She watched droplets slide down the broken lantern glass, collecting into trembling pearls before falling to the dirt. For the first time in months she was dry. Outside, boots approached, heavy, deliberate. Elijah Boone ducked beneath the doorway, shoulders broad enough to dim the lantern's glow. He carried a small sack of flour and 2 tin cups. Water dripped from his hat brim, darkening the floor where he stood. Didn't figure this place would hold through a storm, he said. She looked up, her face still pale from exhaustion, though color had begun to return to her lips. Roof leaks, she murmured. But not too much. He glanced upward, then smiled faintly. I'll mend it tomorrow. His tone was simple, but the promise in it felt heavier than the rain. He lit the lantern again, flame flaring amber through the glass. The light softened both their faces, cutting the hard lines from his and the sorrow from hers. It filled the room with warmth that didn't belong to the season. They sat across from one another on the floor, a few feet apart. Elijah poured water into the cups. You from far west, he said after a long silence. China, she answered. Her accent softened the word into something musical. My husband, she hesitated, her gaze falling to her lap. He worked in mine. Gold. Cave fell. Many die. I burned, saving others. Elijah's eyes flicked to her leg, then away. And no one looked after you? He died. I walk east. People see face like mine, they close door. The simplicity of her truth stilled him. Outside, thunder rolled low across the plains. That's a hard road alone. She looked up. You alone too. He didn't reply. The lantern hissed as rain drummed harder on the roof, and the smell of damp earth crept in. Finally he said, my wife, Sarah, died birthing our boy. Lost them both same night. House has been quiet since. Maylin lowered her eyes as though his grief were a private room she shouldn't enter. I'm sorry, she said. He nodded once, slow. You remind me of her kindness. Not her face, her quiet. The words landed between them like something fragile. Neither spoke for a while. The sound of the rain turned steady, comforting, and the lantern flame wavered against the old walls. Later, when the storm thinned, Elijah rose. You'll stay here till you're steady on that leg. Tomorrow I'll bring food. She wanted to protest, pride stiff in her throat, but when she shifted, pain shot through her knee, silencing her. She only nodded. As he stepped to the door, she said softly, people in town, they not like me. He paused. They don't like anyone different. I stopped trying to change their minds. Then they talk about you too? He smiled without humor. They've been talking since the day I buried Sarah. She thought for a moment, then whispered, I will work. I can clean, cook. Not charity. He studied her, the trembling chin, the unbroken dignity behind it. We'll see, he said, though he knew already he'd let her. When he left, the lantern still burned. Its glow reached the edges of the freight house, touching old crates, dust motes, the worn boards that had forgotten warmth. Malin watched it as if memorizing the light itself. The next day dawned gray. Elijah came back with a tin kettle, dried meat, and a folded blanket. She tried to rise when he entered, wincing from the effort. Stay put, he said, setting the kettle on a crate. I feel useless, she whispered. Can't fix the world in a day, he said. You heal first. He looked around at the place. Bare walls, no bed, no stove, and frowned. You can't stay here long. Town will start talking worse. She hesitated. Where would I go? He didn't answer immediately. He could already hear the whispers outside, the baker's sharp tongue, the men at the saloon calling him a fool. Still, he said, there's an old cabin near my barn. Ain't been used in a year. Roof sound, stove still good. You'll be safe there. Her lips parted in surprise. You trust stranger? Don't have to. Just don't like seeing anyone freeze. When they rode out together that afternoon, she sat behind him on the horse, hands light on his coat. The wind carried the scent of sage and wet wood. The world felt vast and new again, though every jolt of the saddle made her leg ache. Elijah slowed the horse to ease her pain. At the cabin, she stared at the walls, old pine, sunlight slipping through cracks, and whispered, beautiful. He smiled a little. You're the first to say that. He lit the same lantern from the freight house, its glow spilling across her face. For a moment, the flame reflected in her eyes, and he realized how long it had been since anyone looked at him without pity. In the following days, gossip grew. Martha Hensley told anyone who'd listened that the widower Boone had taken in some crippled Chinawoman. The sheriff tried to be kind, but even he warned, you're stirring more talk than you can outrun. Elijah shrugged it off. Talk don't feed a man. Still, he noticed the way folks looked when he rode into town, a mixture of suspicion and scorn. When he returned home that evening, he found Malin sitting outside the cabin, lantern beside her, practicing steps with the cane he'd left on the porch. Where'd you get that? He asked. I found it, she said shyly. Carved name under handle. Samuel Boone. He froze. The cane had belonged to his boy. For a heartbeat, he wanted to take it back to guard the memory it carried, but she was leaning on it, trying to balance, and he couldn't. Keep it, he said quietly. She looked at him as if he'd given her something sacred. It make me strong, she whispered. He turned away, blinking against something raw in his chest. That night, the sky cleared. Through the cabin window, he saw her place the lantern on the sill, flame steady, her shadow bent over the floor as she prayed. The soft gold light trembled against the darkness, and he thought of Sarah again, how she used to light a lamp whenever he came home late from the fields. Now another light waited in his window. The world outside was still cruel, still whispering, but inside that small cabin, a strange peace took root, fragile as ash, warm as fire. Elijah leaned on the porch rail, listening to the crickets, and for the first time in years he didn't feel alone. Yet somewhere beyond the ridge, a darker wind was gathering, the kind that carried more than rain. And as he looked toward the horizon, he felt it. Something in Dawson's Crossing would soon test whatever mercy he'd found. Morning came soft and blue over the valley, mist curling above the grass like breath. Elijah Boone rose before dawn as always, splitting kindling beside the barn, the rhythm of the axe echoing through the stillness. Inside the small cabin, Malin stirred to the smell of wood smoke. Her leg ached, but she could hear him outside, steady, uncomplaining, the way the world once sounded when she still believed in its mercy. When she stepped out with her cane, wrapped in his spare coat, Elijah was already harnessing the mule. I'm heading down to the creek, he said, voice low as gravel. You'll need water up here. Barrel's empty. I can fetch it, she said quickly. He looked at her, eyes narrowing slightly. That leg of yours disagrees. She smiled thinly. Then I make it agree. He hesitated, then gave a small nod, half amusement, half surrender, and handed her the wooden pail. The handle felt rough against her palms. She followed him slowly toward the ridge, one careful step after another. The world was wet and bright after last night's rain. The ground smelled of earth and iron. Malin's limp turned every step into a vow, but she refused his offered hand. By the time they reached the stream, her breath came short. Elijah crouched beside the water, filling his bucket with practiced ease. She knelt too, though her leg trembled. When her reflection rippled across the surface, she hardly recognized it. Thin face, scar cutting through her ankle's shadow, hair falling loose. For years she tried to wash the shame from that reflection, but it always stared back, patient as grief. Elijah watched her dip the pail. The current tugged and water splashed her sleeves. He took it gently from her hands, steadying it. "You don't have to prove you belong here," he said. Her gaze flicked to him. "If I stop trying, they'll say you wasted kindness on me." He looked away, jaw tight. "Folks will talk no matter what you do." She straightened, leaning on her cane. "Then let them talk about the woman who works." Something in her tone, tired but fierce, made him quiet. They walked back side by side, the pails sloshing, the sun rising behind them like a lantern in fog. In town that afternoon, the whispers grew teeth. Martha Hensley told the sewing circle that Boone's charity had turned to fancy. A ranch hand at the saloon said the Chinawoman was living off his pity. Sheriff Dobbs heard it all and said nothing, though his sigh followed Elijah when he left the store. By the time Elijah returned home, the weight of those voices pressed against him like a storm he couldn't see. Malin was outside, kneeling by the garden patch near the porch, turning soil with a small shovel. Her hands were dirty, her sleeves rolled up. The sight stopped him. "You shouldn't be out here on that leg," he said. She looked up, hair clinging to her cheek with sweat. "I can't pay you money," she said simply. "But I can make food grow." He said nothing. The mule brayed behind him, and the wind carried the smell of turned earth. Later he found her by the well, trying to haul a bucket. The rope burned against her palm. The water's pull was stronger than her body. Without a word, he stepped behind her and took the rope. Their hands brushed. For a moment, neither moved, the tension of two solitudes meeting. Then he drew the bucket up, muscles flexing under his shirt, and poured it into her pail. She stared at the rippling surface. "Thank you," she said, barely audible. He shrugged. "Water's heavy for anyone." That evening, Samuel, the neighbor boy, came by with a basket of apples. "Mama says Miss May can have these." He grinned, missing two front teeth. "You're nicer than the folks in town say." Elijah laughed softly, but Mayleen's eyes softened in wonder. "Thank you," she said, bowing slightly. The boy watched her limp back toward the cabin. "Does it hurt?" he asked. "Only when I stop walking," she said. Inside, she placed the apples on the table and lit the lantern. The glow reached the rafters, catching Elijah's face where he sat by the fire. For a while, they listened to the crackle of wood and the distant hiss of rain returning. "I was wife once," she said finally. "Man who bought me, he said I was lucky. Then the mine buried him and luck ended." Elijah stared into the fire. "I buried my luck too." She looked at him, uncertain if it was grief or guilt she heard in his tone. "You love her still?" He nodded. "Love don't end. It just finds quieter places to wait." The lantern flame wavered. Shadows stretched over the walls like memories. Maylin traced the wood grain on the table, feeling its scars beneath her fingertips. "Then maybe love waits for me too," she whispered, not to him but to the dark. The next morning, townsfolk gathered outside the store, their voices low and mean. "She'll ruin him," Martha said. "That foreign cripple bring his name to mud." Sheriff Dobbs frowned. "He's done nothing wrong but be decent." "Sometimes that's wrong enough," Martha snapped. By afternoon, Maylin heard the echoes of those words. A ranch hand spat near her when she passed the well. She said nothing, just lowered her eyes and kept walking, her limp pronounced from pain. Elijah saw it all from the ridge and came down, his face unreadable. He found her washing clothes by the creek. The current carried soap bubbles away like ghosts. Her cane lay beside her, forgotten. He watched her wring the cloth with slow, deliberate strength. "Why do you stay?" he asked quietly. She didn't turn. "Because leaving is worse." The simplicity of it struck him harder than accusation could. He knelt beside her, his reflection joining hers in the water. "They don't know you," he said. "They don't need to," she replied. "Only you do." Their eyes met in the mirrored surface, ripples distorting the fragile truth between them. Then she smiled faintly, almost teasing. "You worry too much." He huffed a dry laugh. "You work too hard." "That is how I live." That night, when the wind died, she baked bread for the first time since coming. The smell filled the cabin. Warm, earthy, forgiving. Elijah sat at the table, elbows on his knees, watching her move carefully between stove and counter. The scarred leg dragged slightly, but her balance was sure. She placed a loaf before him, crust golden and cracked. "Taste," she said. He did. The bread was coarse but tender. It's good, he said. Her face brightened in quiet pride. For a long while they ate without speech. Outside, the wind carried faint laughter from town, but it no longer reached the cabin. When he rose to fetch more wood, she said, "Tomorrow I will bring water again." Alone. He turned. "You'll fall if you push too hard." She met his gaze evenly. "Then you will have to catch me." He froze, just long enough for the air to shift, for something unnamed to bloom between them. Then he smiled, the faintest curve of the mouth, and went out into the night. Through the window, the lantern's light followed him like a living thing, spilling gold over the path. Maylin stood watching, her hand resting on the cane carved with a child's name. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the creek whispered through darkness, steady, endless, patient. And as she listened to it, she wondered if water could carry not just weight, but hope, enough to wash away the shame that had followed her all her life. The wind changed before dawn, bringing with it the dry smell of trouble. Elijah Boone sensed it before the first curl of smoke rose from the valley. He was mending the corral fence when the sky to the south began to bleed orange. The freight house, the one where Maylin had first found shelter, was burning. For a moment he stood still, the hammer loose in his hand, the old boards around him catching the reflection of flame. Then he heard the bell ringing in town and knew what would come next. By the time he rode into Dawson's Crossing, the fire had already eaten half the roof. Townsfolk swarmed like hornets, buckets in hand, curses on their lips. Martha Hensley stood at the front, apron flapping, her voice cutting through the chaos. "She did it," she cried. "That China woman lit it herself. I saw her smoky in clothes this morning." Elijah dismounted before the horse even stopped, striding through the crowd. "Where is she?" Sheriff Dobbs pointed toward the boardwalk, his face lined with fatigue. "Behind the store. Folks found her carrying rags near the alley. I told him to stand down, but they're wound up like snakes." Elijah pushed past him. The freight house crackled behind, timbers splitting like gunfire. Sparks drifted upward, fading into the ash sky. Behind the store, Maylin stood pressed against a wall, her cane clutched like a weapon. Her dress was scorched near the hem, her face streaked with soot and confusion. Around her, a half-circle of townsfolk shouted over one another, fear disguised as fury. "She's cursed this place," someone yelled. "First she took his house, now she'll burn the rest of us out." Maylin's voice trembled but held. "I cook early. Smoke from my stove, not fire. I swear." "Liar," Martha hissed. "You think we'll let you ruin another man?" Elijah stepped into the circle, his voice a low thunder. "Enough." The crowd hesitated. He moved to Maylin's side, placing himself between her and the others. His shirt clung to him with sweat. His eyes burned not from smoke but from something deeper. "You think she'd set fire to a place she once called safe?" he asked. "You all seen her limp through this town beggin' to work for the same people spittin' on her now." Martha's jaw tightened. "Then why was she near it?" "Because it's where she slept when you turned her away," he said. "Because she remembers what kindness feels like, even if you don't." The sheriff raised his hand. "All right now, enough of this," he barked. But the tension hung heavy, brittle as dry grass. Elijah turned to Maylin, voice softer. "Did you see anyone near it?" She shook her head. "Only wind. Then light." He studied her eyes, steady, unflinching, and knew she spoke the truth. The fire dimmed as the roof collapsed, sending up a sigh of sparks. Ash rained down over the street like gray snow. When the last beam fell, silence spread, thick and uneasy. Elijah led her away, one arm firm around her shoulders. The crowd parted reluctantly. Back at the cabin, the smell of smoke followed them like guilt. Maylin sat on the porch, trembling though the air was warm. "They hate me more now," she whispered. "They'll forget," Elijah said, though he didn't believe it. He brought water, washed the soot from her hands. The lantern light flickered between them, gold over gray. "They think I bring curse," she said quietly. "Maybe I do." He crouched before her, hands resting on his knees. "You brought nothing but peace to that place." Her voice cracked. "Then why all this fire?" He had no answer. The silence between them stretched, filled with the faint hiss of embers carried from the valley. That night, he sat awake long after she'd fallen asleep inside. The wind shifted again and distant thunder murmured beyond the ridge. He thought of the town's eyes, of their whispering mouths, of the way pity always curdled into cruelty. He had carried his grief like armor once, but Maylin's quiet had cracked it open. Now their judgment fell not only on her but on the piece of him that still dared to hope. By morning, Word had spread farther than he'd imagined. The blackened shell of the freight house drew travelers from nearby ranches. Someone nailed a sign to its remains. "We don't need her kind." When Elijah saw it, something inside him broke cleanly. He pulled the sign down and rode back hard, dust rising behind him like smoke reborn. At the cabin, Maylin was washing clothes in a tin basin. She looked up as he approached, eyes tired but calm. "You went to town?" she said. He nodded, jaw clenched. "They won't stop." "I know," she said softly. He stared at her, at the scarred leg, at the hands still moving through water. "You ever think about leaving?" "Every day," she said. "But I don't. Because where would I go? The world burns everywhere." The word stilled him. He sat beside her on the steps. The bucket of water shimmered between them, reflecting the morning light. "You shouldn't have to fight like this," he said. "You fight too," she replied. "Only your fire is inside." He looked up sharply. "What's that mean?" "You think kindness is weakness. But it's the only thing that kept you alive after she died." The truth hit him like a breath drawn too deep. He turned away, eyes wet from wind or something else. She placed her hand lightly on his arm, small, warm, steady. "I don't want to be your burden," she said. "But maybe I can be your peace." He covered her hand with his. The gesture said everything words could not. That evening the sky flared red again, not from fire but from sunset. The town's anger had cooled to smoldering rumor, but Elijah knew flame lived beneath the ridge, waiting. When the knock came after dark, he opened the door to Sheriff Dobbs. The man's hat dripped rain. His expression was grim. "Elijah," he said, "you best come with me. Someone broke into the storehouse. Found this near the barrels." He held out a rag, singed, smelling faintly of kerosene. Maylene's sewing thread clung to its edge. Elijah's pulse stilled. "That ain't hers," he said quietly. "I figured," the sheriff said. "But others won't. They're talking about running her out by sunrise. I can't hold him if you don't speak up." Elijah's hand curled into a fist. "They'll have to go through me first." Dobbs sighed. "I was afraid you'd say that." He stepped closer, voice low. "You got a choice. Take her away tonight or I'll be burying someone by morning." When the sheriff rode off, the rain began again, a fine, relentless drizzle that soaked the earth. Maylin stood in the doorway, lantern in hand. "What'd he say?" Elijah looked at her, heart hammering against the truth. "He said we have to leave." She stared at him for a long moment, then blew out the lantern. The darkness closed in around them, broken only by the red glow of distant coals still burning beneath the ridge, the fire that would not die, the one now burning in both their hearts. The rain did not stop through the night. It came down steady and thin, whispering against the roof like an old lullaby. Inside the cabin, Elijah Boone sat beside the dying fire, his hands clasped, his mind running through every road that might save them. Maylin slept in the small room beyond, her breath soft, her face turned toward the wall as if hiding from the world. Every so often, thunder shuddered over the ridge, and the flames flickered in reply. When morning broke, the rain had turned to fog. The fields were gray ghosts and the sky hung low enough to touch. Elijah stepped outside and saw the trail that led down toward Dawson's Crossing, half drowned in mud. He knew what would be waiting at the end of it, faces twisted by fear, words shaped like knives. The sheriff's warning still echoed, "Take her away or lose her forever." He saddled the horse quietly, tying a blanket and a loaf of bread behind the saddle. When he came back inside, Maylin was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, eyes calm but unreadable. "You plan to run?" she said softly. He froze. "We can't stay, May. They'll come." She nodded once, her gaze falling to her hands. "Then we go where no one knows my face." He wanted to tell her the truth, that there was no such place, that prejudice traveled faster than horses, but he couldn't break the small hope in her tone. Instead he said, "We'll find somewhere better." As he helped her mount, her hand brushed his, light as falling ash. "You think mercy is running," she whispered. "But mercy is staying when it hurts." He looked at her for a long moment, her hair loose in the morning wind, her eyes steady despite the fear behind them. He swung into the saddle and said, "Then I'll stay until it hurts no more." They rode out across the ridge. Below them, the world was a sea of mist. For a while, the silence between them was enough. The creak of the saddle, the steady rhythm of hooves, the faint slosh of the river they'd have to cross. But as they neared the bend, Elijah saw movement on the trail ahead. Shapes. 5 men, rifles slung, waiting. He slowed. Maylene's hand tightened on his coat. "Town men?" He nodded once. "Stay behind me." When they reached the curve, Sheriff Dobbs stepped forward from the group, hand raised. Elijah, don't make this worse. They're scared. Let her go. Scared? Elijah's voice was low, dangerous. Of a woman with a cane? Martha Hensley's husband, a thick-set man with a red beard, spat into the mud. She burned our storehouse. She'll burn the rest of us next. She burned nothing, Elijah said. You want truth, you look to the wind that carried your own lanterns too close to the hay. The man raised his rifle. Get out of the way. Elijah dismounted slowly, eyes locked on them. You'll have to shoot me first. The sheriff cursed under his breath. For God's sake, Boone. But it was too late. One of the men lunged forward, grabbing Maylene's sleeve. She cried out, losing her grip on the cane, falling hard into the mud. The sound tore through Elijah like a bullet. In 2 strides he was there, his fist catching the man's jaw with a crack that echoed through the ridge. The rifle clattered to the ground. Enough, the sheriff shouted. But the moment had turned. The others backed away, faces pale. Elijah knelt beside Maylene, helping her up, his hands steady even as his breath shook. You all done? He said, voice raw. 'Cause if this is the kind of men you've become, you'll never build a town worth living in. Dobbs holstered his weapon and looked away. Go, Elijah. Before they find their courage again. He nodded once, lifting Maylene back onto the horse. As they rode away, no one followed. They traveled until the sun fell low in gold, until the land opened into a clearing ringed by willows. A small stream ran through it, cold and clean. Maylene dismounted slowly, wincing as her foot touched the ground. This place, she whispered. It feels quiet. Elijah crouched by the water, scooping a handful to his lips. It was sweet, untouched. We can stay a while, he said. She knelt beside him, watching her reflection ripple beside his. For the first time in months, her shoulders relaxed. You think they will forget? He shook his head. They'll move on to hating something else. But they'll remember what we did. She looked at him, the faintest smile at the edge of her lips. Then let what they remember be courage. He broke a piece of the bread they'd carried, handing her half. And kindness, he said. They ate in silence, the taste plain but honest. Above them, the wind stirred the willows, scattering sunlight through the leaves. For a moment it felt like peace. Later, Elijah built a small fire from fallen branches. Maylene sat beside it, her face glowing in the orange light. He watched her trace the rim of her cup, fingers delicate, the reflection of flame dancing in her eyes. You ever think of home? He asked. This is home, she said simply. He hesitated. You don't even have a roof yet. Roof can come later, she said. First must come safety. And heart. He stared at her for a long moment, the fire crackling between them. Then he reached into his pocket and drew out something small, a simple gold ring dulled by time. He placed it on the ground between them. I kept it because I didn't know how to let go, he said. But maybe letting go is the only way to begin again. Her eyes glistened. You give this to me? He nodded. Not for what we were. For what we could still be. She picked up the ring, turning it between her fingers, then slipped it gently onto the chain around her neck. I cannot walk fast, she said softly. But I will walk with you. He smiled, the first full smile in years. Then that's enough. The fire popped, sending sparks into the night. Somewhere far behind them, the ridge still smoldered, its glow faint against the horizon. But here, beside the water, the air was cool and clear. As the stars rose, Elijah spread his coat over her shoulders. She leaned into him, her head against his chest, their breath rising together like prayer. In the quiet, he murmured, We'll build a new place come spring. A cabin near this stream. Maybe even a garden. She closed her eyes. With bread and water, she said. And peace. And home, he added. When dawn came, the fire had gone to embers. The mist lifted from the stream, revealing 2 figures asleep beneath the willows, a man whose grief had finally loosened its hold, and a woman whose wounds had turned to light. An old voice would one day tell their story to strangers, saying, There was a time mercy rode a horse through the rain, and love grew from the ashes of hate. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Let's keep this fire of compassion alive together. Subscribe to Wild West Tales, where every week we ride back into the dust and dawn of forgotten souls, widows, outcasts, wounded hearts, and quiet heroes who find love and redemption in the loneliest corners of the frontier. Your one click helps these stories reach more people who believe kindness still matters. Hit subscribe, leave a comment if this tale moved you, and share it with someone who could use a little hope tonight. And before you go, click on the story appearing on your screen right now. It's even more powerful than this one, a journey that will stay with you long after the credits fade. Saddle up, friend. Let's ride toward the next heart that needs to be healed.